My name is Al Hayes, and I am the co-chair of the Iowa Justice Action Network. And I want to welcome everybody today, both here and on Zoom. Now, our pastor, Emma Peterson, and I will turn the mic over to her to give you a greeting from the Cedar Valley Unitarian Universalists.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hi.
Good morning. Hi, Zoom. Oh, wow, you've got great attendance on Zoom. That's wonderful. You are at the Cedar Valley Unitarian Universalists, the CVUU. We are Unitarian Universalists. We're a non-doctrinal plural faith. And every Sunday morning, along with every other Unitarian Universalist congregation in the world, we light our chalice, which is here in the center of our altar. And it's a symbol of our shared commitment to justice and liberation for all. So I'm going to light that chalice this morning. And first, I'm going to invite you into the spirit of prayer and reflection. Spirit of life, great mystery, whose truest name is love. We come before you this morning with hearts aching and open for justice. It seems we arrive here during a time when the world is truly on fire. Every moment there is a new crisis, a new genocide, a new war, a new mass shooting. This morning, we probably come with hearts that are in Maine and in the Middle East and all over the world. We ask that in the swirling chaos of the moment, you help us to find center and peace. We ask that you help our minds to focus and our hearts to open so that we can build a new and better world together. We ask that you bless all those who have organized today's conference in the work for justice. Bless the speakers who have gathered here, and bless all those that are working and fighting for shared liberation. We pray this in the name of all that is holy, and together we say, Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Emma. Really appreciate your providing a welcome for us this morning. So I was recognizing and thanking our students that have helped us out this morning, and they're done a great job for us. And speaking of recognizing and thanking people, I want to recognize our board members. I think most of them have already introduced themselves, but would IJAN board members please stand up and be recognized? Chuck? You're supposed to, and we have Pam Hayes, my wife, and then we have Wendy Whitrock, who didn't stand because, oh, she's in the back. I thought she was still down there handing out food. Okay. She really helped us with the breakfast food this morning. And then Doug Marshall, who's helped us in any number of ways, takes minutes and all kinds of other good stuff and helps recruit some of our speakers. And then Christy Hutchison, Christy, this is the first conference that we've held where we were using our new website for registration. And so it was quite a process, if you've ever done that before, to get it to sync with PayPal and all that stuff that you have to do to make the online registration work. Our website is brand new. We just got it online. Our old website died on us, and it took us quite a while to get a new website up and running. And if you want any more information about IJAN, it's just IowaJusticeActionNetwork.org, all one word, all lowercase, and you can go on and see what's going on with our organization. And so Christy has just been invaluable in helping us get that set up and helping us get other aspects of our website set up. And also, this conference is being recorded, and so she will at some point probably chop it up into different pieces, and then you'll have it available online. And of course, our co-chair of IJAN is Sue Hutchins, and she had a family emergency today and is not available. She's not going to be here. She was very sorry she was unable to be here. And of course, Chuck Lane has helped us out with a number of things. And I already mentioned with technical support with Christy helping us out with that. And then we have a volunteer from the congregation here, Mandy Booty, who's back there on her, and she's we call her our sanctuary tech because she handles what's going on here in the sanctuary. And then Christy will also be serving as our Zoom host. And we really thank Mandy for being willing to volunteer to be here for the whole day. Yeah, most of you have already gotten your coffee and goodies downstairs, and you can slip out and get more coffee if you want. And we'll be serving lunch down in our fellowship hall, down those steps. That the lunch will be at 12:10. It's being provided by East Kitchen, great outfit here in Waterloo. Now, those of you that are receiving social work CEUs today, you will need to sign in there with your license number at the registration table. And then also people on Zoom that are receiving CEUs will need to put your name and license number in the chat, and we will capture those and send them into the UNI Department of Social Work, which is the one that's granting the CEUs. You get 5 CEUs we attend today. Our co-chair, Sue Hutchins, prepared a number of collections of essays by people who have either are in prison right now or have been in prison, women, men, people of color. And she's prepared a series of books that share their reflections. And these are really powerful books. And we have some of them on the table back there right next to the door. They're Amy Landers Kearney has also prepared a book about her experiences in the system, and that's available on the same table. Okay, we'll finally get to our keynote here. I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Josh Rovner from the Sentencing Project. IJAN has developed a very productive partnership with the Sentencing Project over the past 2 or 3 years, and we really appreciate their supporting this conference. And believe me, if there's anything you want to know about anything in criminal justice, you can hardly go to a better source than the Sentencing Project. It's just the sentencingproject.org, and they have all kinds of studies on all aspects of the criminal justice system. I highly recommend that website if you want to educate yourself further on some of these issues. Josh Rovner joined the Sentencing Project in 2014 and has been their Director of Youth Justice since 2022. And his work aims to limit the number of children and adolescents involved in juvenile and adult justice systems by closing pathways to adult courts and supporting alternatives to incarceration. His work also encompasses the youth that are serving extreme sentences. Josh's work has supported reforms in numerous states through research and testimony. He's the author of several papers and fact sheets for the Sentencing Project and has provided data analysis on racial and ethnic disparities in youth justice. And he's also had opinion pieces published in various prominent publications such as the Atlantic and Washington Post, etc. And prior to joining the Sentencing Project, Josh worked on public health campaigns such as access to primary and mental health care, tobacco prevention, and health education. And he has his undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Rochester and a Master in Public Policy from George Washington University. So I'll welcome Josh as our zooming in from Washington, D.C. today.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'm speaking to you from Oklahoma City today. There's a legislative panel that's reviewing youth justice issues here. And I bring that up because the issues that you're facing in Iowa really aren't that different than the ones that I'm facing at home in Maryland or here in Oklahoma City. There's problems with this system that can be overcome, and it's conferences like this one where those solutions start. You can go to our website and learn about the Sentencing Project. I appreciate Alan's kind words for the work that we do. As Director of Youth Justice, I manage a very small team that conducts research and advocacy on those central goals about shrinking the footprint of our justice system and the massive disparities in those systems. Because I've been doing this work for about 10 years now, I often hear that things are somehow worse or tougher than they've been in the past. I'm really not sure that's true. Legislating is always hard. About 150,000 bills are going to be introduced in state legislators this year, and a scant percentage of them actually become law. Most of them even die without a hearing taking place. But that said, things do feel a little different right now. I feel like we're playing a little bit more defense than we've been. There's some reason to fear a return to mistakes of the past, even though we ought to know better by now. So what follows is a bit of a history lesson, a snapshot of where things stand. And whatever is happening now, we can take advantage of the hindsight from those prior eras. The reports of increased crime, and whether those are based in data or merely anecdote, really ought to worry anyone who cares about youth justice. In the late 1980s and 1990s, actual increases in youth offending and changes in policy led to vastly more teenagers being sent to adult prisons and jails, as well as juvenile facilities. Pundits were ignorant of the harshness embedded in the system and claimed that even more incarceration was needed or teen crime would only accelerate. In those years, constituents' fears led and politicians followed. Today, we have ample evidence that leaders from the 1990s did not, that harsh responses to teens' poor decision-making will fail. Teenagers make bad decisions because they're teenagers. They're immature, they're impulsive, they're unduly influenced by their peers. But I really don't see the same excuse for adults when they too prove themselves swayed by cherry-picked anecdotes or media narratives. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that the predicted carnage from the mid-90s did not arrive. Instead, youth offending began a long decline. Drops in youth arrests then coincided with drops in incarceration. And over the course of the 21st century, locking up fewer kids hasn't resulted in more crime. It's been followed by less crime. The current era of juvenile justice reform is based around a better understanding of adolescent development, limiting out-of-home placement and keeping more young people out of criminal courts designed for adults. Please note, I did not say ending those practices, but limiting. We've made a lot of progress, but there's still so much work to do. Still, more than half of states have redefined their juvenile codes, statutory purposes since 2000, mostly away from punitive visions. I don't believe Iowa is one of those states. According to the federal government, at least as of 2019, Iowa was still using a purpose clause from 1979, and that one's nearly identical to one from 1959. So there's work to do here. Limiting out-of-home placement and keeping more young people out of criminal courts designed for adults aren't new ideas, nor are they particularly innovative. Decades of research, along with documentation of the horrors of youth placement, confirm that America locks up too many of its young people. No other country does so nearly as often. The common sense vision is often aspiration. The system's footprint remains enormous, and indefensible racial and ethnic disparities pervade. Those successes really are plentiful. There's far fewer court-involved youth today than 25 years ago, and far fewer harmful facilities in operation. The history of justice reform, marked by waves and retreats, barely connected to actual teen offending, reveals how precarious this can all be. Given the growing political rhetoric around the public fears of crime and criticisms of reform, I really wonder whether the current era is politically sustainable. And that's a question yet to be answered. The Sentencing Project is marking 2023 as the 50th anniversary of mass incarceration, the start of the era of mass incarceration, when the historic rise in total incarceration began. Growth in youth incarceration, as we'll see, began on a different timetable. The mid-1970s also witnessed the passage of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 1974, which established the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The JDPA was built on the understanding that youth who offend should be treated differently and separately from adults who offend, that juvenile offending is preventable, and that youthful offenders should receive individualized treatment and services. The establishment of an autonomous office symbolized the heightened concerns over a flawed system. This is 40, 50 years ago. The JDPA fit in neatly with a set of due process improvements to a chaotic and unfair system. That era started with the Supreme Court's ruling in re Galt, a ruling that rejected a paternalistic vision of juvenile justice that believed that courts and juvenile detention centers could supplant the child's own parents, even for behavior as mundane as crank phone calls. Prior to the JJDPA's passage, a huge proportion of kids in juvenile facilities were accused of nothing more than a status offense. Experts then described a consensus limiting training schools and youth prisons for the most serious and violent cases. 20 years later, this is 1995 we're talking about, so get out your flannel and your CD collections. With youth offending and arrests on the rise, many believe, excuse me, I'm going to need some water. By the mid-90s, many believed the juvenile justice system's alleged leniency was to blame for the increases in youth offending. A political scientist named John DiIulio predicted a demographic crime bomb of remorseless super predators, and along with urging more religious piety, argued that the nation, quote, will have little choice but to pursue genuine, get-tough law enforcement strategies against the super predators. Now, contrary to DiIulio's imagined lenient system, his wish had already been granted. There were about 4,000 people under 18 in adult prisons and jails in 1985, and that count tripled by 1995. That was a massive increase in years that youth offending grew by 36%. More than 6 out of 10 incarcerated youths were confined in an overcrowded facility. Other data from this era suggests that the criminalization of adolescents was already well underway. True, arrests for the most serious offenses were up by about 80% from 1985 to 1995, but those increases were exceeded by or matched by increases in youth arrests for disorderly conduct, for curfew and loitering, for drug offenses. Those are timeless hallmarks of youth that are significantly and thankfully less common than violent offenses. Then, as now, many arrests reflected politicians' choices to criminalize adolescents rather than understand that this is a normal part of the adolescent development process. And that was especially true when the adolescents were Black or brown. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, states passed laws to encourage more placements, built cruel boot camps, and sent more youth into adult courts, jails, and prisons. Youthfulness, instead of being seen as a rationale for temperance, was argued as a reason for fear. One example of this is in 1994, seeking to execute Christopher Roper, Missouri prosecutors argued that his youth, because Roper was 17 at the time of when he was arrested for murder, they argued his youth should be a reason to fear him. Doesn't that scare you? He asked the jury. Now, in 2001, with crime falling, our friend, the political scientist John DiIulio, publicly renounced that super predator theory, recognizing its many flaws. Christopher Roper's death sentence was overturned by 2005 Supreme Court, which found the death penalty to be disproportionate for people under 18 years old, a decision that rippled through later decisions on extreme sentencing as well. That same year, the Campaign for Youth Justice was founded to protect youth from the ravages of the adult criminal justice system and succeeded in its Raise the Age campaigns from states from Massachusetts to Missouri to Michigan and beyond. Foundations like the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation led the donor community with long-term investments to find and fund new, common-sense, non-carceral solutions. Youth offending dropped during those years, bolstering the impact of the reforms. Returning 16 and 17-year-olds to juvenile courts proved far less costly than policymakers and accountants predicted. Self-reported survey data showed far less criminal behavior among high schoolers, reflected in indicators such as fights and illicit drug use. And from 2000 to 2022, youth arrests fell 80% and youth placements fell 77%. Still, the complex maze of harsh laws and policies that passed in the 1980s and 1990s have proven stubbornly difficult to unwind, even as youth offending has fallen dramatically since those years. Many states rolled back their laws, but others remain unchanged. So while we're here to talk about youth, I think there's lessons here for the adult system as well. This century's sharp drops in youth incarceration are pretty hard to replicate for adults. Youth under supervision, whether probation or placement, typically age out of the juvenile justice system's jurisdiction by age 21. Emptying a bathtub requires not only shutting off the water, but emptying the drain as well. And opening the drain is vastly easier in the juvenile system when young people age out of its jurisdiction. In the adult system, extreme sentences such as life without the realistic possibility of parole leave far too many people locked up for decades-old crimes, even when those crimes are committed in adolescence. On the other hand, teenagers, as long as they're not sentenced as if they were adults, age out of juvenile supervision. The feedback loop is much faster, allowing for rapid decarceration as reforms take hold and offending drops. So despite key differences between criminal and juvenile justice, the youth system successes point to a clear pathway to close the book on adult mass incarceration as well. Less reliance on incarceration initially and more opportunities for release for those who are incarcerated. I'm definitely concerned that political pressures are going to force an end to this era of reform. For years, Americans via polling have said that they believe that crime is increasing even as it fell. So it's not exactly clear that seeing that proportion increase from 65% to 75% ought to decimate what's working. But I've seen new laws passed over the last years that will encourage more pretrial detention of arrested youth. We're seeing that in the District of Columbia in Kentucky, and other states are planning to build more youth prisons. That's happening in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Texas. Annie Casey Foundation has found longer lengths of stay, but only for youth of color at hundreds of detention centers across the country. We already know that those ideas won't work because they've been tried for the last 50 years, but politics is always a relentless opponent. We know that incarceration damages both public safety and the well-being of the incarcerated child. We know that charging youth in adult courts makes it more likely that they'll reoffend. We know that teen curfews and other aggressive policing do not reduce crime, but probably increase it. The leaders of the 1990s didn't know these things with certainty, but after 50 years of failures, we can look at the evidence that a shrunken system is better for all of us. With that, I'm going to use the next 15 minutes or so to walk through some data about what we know about youth offending. I think I'll be sharing these slides through Alan and leaving 15 minutes or so for questions at the end. So let me share my screen and put this into presentation mode. Excellent. Thank you very much. This is the data that I was talking about, drops in youth arrests. These numbers date back to 1980, which is as far back as I have the data. There's an unmistakable pattern here. Increased youth crime reflected in arrests through the 1980s and early 1990s, followed by a steady decline. By 2020, the most recent year that we have data for, youth arrests, that's people between the ages of 10 and 17, fell by 80%. And it's also important to realize what a slim proportion the most serious offenses are in that. It's about 5% of what the FBI calls violent offenses: murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Assaults for things like, arrests for things like fights, thefts, and drug possession are the most common reasons that young people get arrested. Now, if I separated out that red portion, you'd see a similar pattern of an increase through the 80s and 90s, peaked a little earlier than overall arrests, but also has dropped significantly. Here's that polling data that I was talking about earlier. And if you go all the way to the right side of the screen, this is the answer to Gallup's poll. Do you think there's more crime in the US than there was a year ago or less? And right now we're in about the mid-70s of Americans saying that crime is increasing. But if you look to your left and you see the gray bars, it was averaging around 65% instead of averaging around 75%. This is why this sort of gives me cause for optimism that Americans always believe crime is going up, regardless of whether it is or isn't. Now, I think those 10 percentage points of Americans are making a lot of noise, and certainly the media coverage is getting a little harsher. But I just want everyone to take this long-term view to understand that this aspect of our public dialogue is not new. Another important thing to keep in mind is that youth comprise a shrinking proportion of arrests. Something really interesting has happened over time, and that's a smaller and smaller proportion of arrests are people under 18. I want to walk you through this graph starting on the left side, which starts in 1980. The red line is the juvenile arrest rate. Again, those are people aged 10 to 17 years old. And the blue line is the total arrest rate for all adults. Now, it's not surprising to me that the youth arrest rate was higher than the overall arrest rate. The overall arrest rate includes newborn babies and people in nursing homes. But over time, it's actually gotten lower, meaning that the proportion, and this is as we move to the right side and the current year's data, that you can see that youth arrest rate is lower than the overall arrest rate. And that's because we're seeing a larger proportion in the what's often called the emerging adults set, people 18 to 21, 18 to 24 years old. Good things happen when fewer kids are arrested. We've seen a lot fewer kids locked up on a single day. It peaked around 110,000 in the year 2000, and the most recent year closer to 25,000 kids locked up on a typical day. Obviously far too many, but let's not lose sight of these successes. And not only that, but we've seen vastly fewer kids in adult prisons and jails. That number's dropped by 84% since 1997. Now, why do we care about any of this? What difference does it make whether one kid is locked up or 100,000 kids are locked up? And it's because the research is very clear that our system of locking up young people when they get into trouble has been an abject failure. On screen, a screenshot of a paper that we released 8 months ago or so titled Why Youth Incarceration Fails, summarizing the research of all of the ways that it doesn't work. First of all, kids who are locked up are more likely to reoffend than kids who are not locked up. And I really want to be clear that we're talking about similarly situated youth here. I am not comparing Tony Soprano to Lisa Simpson here. This is absolutely kids who have similar backgrounds, similar offending history, similar age. Any way that you want to compare comparable kids, that's what that data shows. Moreover, damages future success and well-being, things like career achievement or high school graduation. We know that facilities are often dangerous and even abusive. In my home state of Maryland, they just lifted the statute of limitations about child abuse. And on the day that law went into effect, dozens of people who have been incarcerated in Maryland's youth prisons sued the state for the abuse that happened while they were housed there. That echoes a lawsuit that happened in New Hampshire recently, echoes a lawsuit that happened in Florida recently. The abuse is part of what happens in these facilities. I wish it weren't true, but the pattern is unmistakable. Fourth, youth incarceration, as I'll show with some data later on, inflicted disproportionately on youth of color. We shouldn't find it acceptable to have these outcomes for any of our kids, but they are not felt equally among all of our populations. Youth incarceration fails because it conflicts with everything that we know about healthy adolescent development. Kids thrive when they're surrounded by caring adults and having good role models in their lives and having a good peer group. When you send a kid to a detention center or youth prison, almost all of those things collapse. I think that all of us who are parents really look forward to our kids having high-achieving kids who are doing great in life, and sending a kid to a detention center changes their peer group. And last, the facilities exacerbate the traumas that often brought kids into the facilities in the first place. Let me show you how Iowa compares to the rest of the country on this. So we'll look at some numbers on the right side of the screen. The US youth incarceration rate is those numbers in black, separated by the dotted line, where Iowa is shown in, I don't know what you'd call that, light blue. Iowa's youth incarceration rate has consistently been higher than the national average, but you can see a similar pattern of decline over the last 10 years in both Iowa and the national average. Both have fallen by about 2/3. It's important to realize that a youth incarceration rate is comprised of two pieces: detention, which is upon arrest and before a young person's hearing in juvenile court, and commitment, which is the equivalent of prison on the adult side. Those are kids who have been adjudicated delinquent or having a juvenile conviction. Interestingly enough, Iowa has a higher than average detention rate, that's pretrial, and a lower than average commitment rate. I'm going to skip past this because where we are on time and move to important data about racial and ethnic disparities. I'm going to focus on Black-white disparities. Nationwide, Black youth are 4.5 times as likely to be incarcerated as their white peers are. And in Iowa, that's even worse. It's closer to 9 times as likely. So how do we get those racial and ethnic disparities? I think it's important to realize that offending rates are pretty similar among all of our kids. The CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey asks questions about getting into fights, using drugs, carrying weapons, and you really see very few meaningful differences among youth of different backgrounds. That said, the most serious offenses are committed more often by youth of color than by white youth. That does not explain the disparities in incarceration, because the most serious offenses comprise maybe 1/3 of kids who are locked up on a typical day. Now, youth of color are more likely to be arrested, despite the fact that their behaviors aren't that different. And then after arrest, they're treated much more harshly. White youth are given more second chances, less likely to be detained at the outset for those who are adjudicated delinquent. White youth are more likely to get probation, and Black youth and brown youth are more likely to be locked up. And so while nationally, Black youth are about 2.5 times as likely to be arrested, they're 4.7 times more likely to be incarcerated. The disparities grow at every point of contact in the system. Let me go over Iowa's racial and ethnic disparities as the nationwide one, while the white youth incarceration rate is pretty close. Interestingly enough, when we look at the states with the highest Black youth incarceration rates, among the states with a meaningful number of Black youth, Iowa finds itself really smack dab in the middle of a lousy neighborhood. Your neighbors like Missouri and Nebraska and nearby states, Iowa, I don't know if I'd call that nearby, but other Midwestern states also have very high rates of Black youth incarceration. What do we recommend to shrink our use of incarceration in this country? First of all, we need to legislate limits of the reasons that kids can be locked up in the first place, ending the detention and commitment of youth charged with status offenses, with misdemeanors, with violations of probation. These seem like common sense steps that we really shouldn't be locking up kids who did not commit serious offenses. Ending the detention and commitment of kids under 14 years old is a step that we also recommend. And for kids who currently are in placement, having independent child advocates to review the kids who are locked up to identify which ones of them can go home. Interestingly enough, during COVID, we saw youth commitments plummet because that was taking place. As the effort was made to shrink the number of kids in facilities, states were really letting kids go home earlier, or ones who were not charged with serious offenses in the first place. Those are things that should be happening anyway, but under a public health emergency, it actually took place. As far as addressing racial and ethnic disparities, we recommend that states use racial impact statements to see what the impact of the laws are. Many of you are probably familiar with environmental impact statements. This is the kind of law that would allow any law just to be reviewed for what its impact will be on people of different backgrounds. We also recommend redirecting money in departments of juvenile justice. Running facilities is a crazy expensive way to treat kids. And it would be even better to know that it worked, but it fails. So we definitely recommend redirecting money toward community-based programs and improving the data so that it's readily available so that we can see what changes are happening county by county. Another set of our recommendations is to increase the youth use of juvenile diversion. You can find that report on our website. We find that it's really one of the hidden points of racial and ethnic disparities. that youth of color are less likely to be diverted and white youth are more likely to be diverted. The bad data backs this up. We have recommendations of how to address that. And probably starting early next year, we're going to release a set of new papers following up on that report. I think that leaves us about 15 minutes or so. The last thing that I'm going to say as I zip past some other slides is that there are effective alternatives to youth incarceration, advocate mentor programs that are out there, credible messengers and family functional therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy that combines both the therapy with the mentorship model. Restorative justice programs, even for youth with very serious offenses, have shown excellent outcomes, and then combinations of those things. So let me stop there. We have 15 minutes left in the hour, and I'll be really happy to chat with you about what's happening in Iowa and your experiences. So thank you.
There are questions or comments from people here in our in-person audience. Yes. I hate to make it come up, but it is just because of the Zoom thing.
Thank you, sir. I was going to ask if the PowerPoint presentation you showed us, is that available for us to look at? I saw a bunch of people trying to get a hold of the statistics they saw.
Yeah, so I haven't shared it with Alan yet, but at some point today, before I get on a plane, I'll email the slides to him.
Oh, thank you. We'll make them available for sure.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Okay, let's go to Zoom.
David Devanis, you go ahead and
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, I may have missed this, but I'd like to know why the rate of arrests has dropped over the past several years. What general factors are helping to mitigate this problem globally in the world?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing that's happened. We're definitely seeing better behavior among this generation of teenagers in a lot of ways. They are more likely to wear a seatbelt and a bike helmet. They're less likely to drink alcohol and do drugs, and any number of behaviors that are positive ones. And so less likely to get into fights or other things that are the reason the kids get arrested. I imagine shoplifting is less common. I think I haven't seen great research explaining why this is, but I have a couple of theories of why that would be. First, people do really stupid things when they drink. And so you see less drinking among this population, this generation of kids, than when I was in high school. I graduated in the mid-90s, and there was a lot more drinking in high school parties then than there is now. CDC backs this up. And so I think it's not that surprising that we see less teen pregnancy and less fighting and stuff that comes out of that. Another thing is, I think, again, this is not backed by research. These are sort of my theories from having read this. Second, kids are living their social lives online to a great extent. So we're seeing kids just physically being in the same space less often with each other, which makes it harder for them to get cigarettes and alcohol and get into fights and get each other pregnant. But these are things that happen when you're not physically in the same space. Now, at the same time, we're seeing increases in cyberbullying. Not surprisingly, that wasn't really a thing in the mid-1990s when I was in high school. And lastly, I think that there's reason to believe that helicopter parenting probably has some impact. Kids don't live independent lives in the way that they did. I generally believe that people are people and respond to the situation that they're in. So I think that the differences in offending aren't really about the fact that my kids are better than I was in high school, though in some ways they are. But I think that it's ways that the environment has changed. I think that it's really good that we're seeing less drinking. I think that there's positive outcomes from all of this helicopter parenting, which drives me nuts in a lot of ways. And I also think that having kids living their social lives online probably has had a good impact. I keep waiting for the answer to that question. Like, it's an important one. I don't know, but we really have seen good drops in behaviors that we don't want to see from our kids.
Thank you. Mandy Gidley. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Josh, I was just wondering if you have recommendations for communities that don't have a lot of resources. I think sadly for the amount of kids we have in the justice system in Waterloo, for instance, there is no general mentoring program. There are a few small targeted programs, but finding activities or mentoring or any kind of diversion things for youth is very difficult here. And so it's tough to know how to help the kids I work with who are on probation or trying to keep them out of the system.
Yeah, it's an excellent question and a big challenge. And I think that if you go to that paper that we wrote about alternatives to incarceration, you see some excellent organizations. Youth advocate programs is in a whole lot of states. Credible messaging, credible messenger mentoring run by a guy named Clinton Lacey. He used to run the District of Columbia's Department of Youth and Rehabilitative Services, has started doing that. And I think that the challenges of implementation are very real. I think that what's clear to me, though, is that the money exists to do these things if we redirect them, right? It's really expensive to run a detention center. It's really expensive to run out-of-home placement. And I think that repurposing that money is going to be the core issue of how that is funded, assuming that you aren't going to be getting tax increases through, or that the expenses of running your school system or your Medicare and Medicaid is also choking the budget. This is a slim portion of state budgets, right? Like state budgets go toward healthcare and education. And I think to have better outcomes in the juvenile system is really about redirecting those dollars already allocated to the juvenile system to places where we have better outcomes. And that's away from the deep end of the system. Launching the programs or hiring companies like ROCA, which is based out of Baltimore, or youth advocate programs, which is all over the place. I'm sure that they would give time to at least walk through how to launch a program like that in your community too.
Thank you, Josh. I've got a question in the chat on Zoom. I'm going to read out loud.
Okay.
This is from Laura. We have seen younger and younger youth aged 10 or so in detention and other facilities. What resources are provided or education available to places unsure what to do with and for violent, in quotes, young pre-adolescent youth?
The essential problem is to see a 10-year-old, or apparently younger than 10, as if that person is a criminal and not a victim themselves of a set of circumstances. There is very little doubt in my mind that the hypothetical young person that we're talking about has been traumatized in any number of ways by poverty or unstable housing or other things like that. None of that negates the fact that there is a victim of whatever happened, and whether that child was involved in a carjacking or a violent attack or something like that. That's an upsetting thing to deal with. The juvenile justice system is completely ill-equipped to deal with a kid that young. The system is really built, to the extent that's built for anyone, for 15, 16, 17-year-old kids. And I think to see that as a problem for social services, for the mental health system, to address the underlying behaviors to get that kid on a better path, because really the juvenile system is much more about punishment than therapy, even though we wish that it weren't. I think that a kid who's behaving in that way really needs to learn much more about empathy and the impact of his or her behaviors on the rest of the community. And I think that we really need to involve the rest of the family in this to see what on earth is going on in that kid's life that would lead a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old to a violent offense. I also think that it's important that the police who make the arrests not miscategorize what happened here. I see anecdotes of 6-year-olds getting arrested for attacking their teachers because they threw a pencil at a teacher, something like that. These are overwhelmingly kids with learning disabilities. In the police, it's a view that they have when you're holding a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail, right? That's the cliche. We really need to get away from seeing misbehavior as being criminal acts and think of it as things that need to be addressed outside of the justice system, especially for younger kids. And once we have those successes for younger kids, I think that we can expand them to an older set of tweens and beyond that.
Hey, Josh, I just want to thank you for your presentation. If this is too broad of a question, you could totally pass on it. I don't mind. I work in the world of churches, and pandemic, of course, which we are very much still living with, has taught us a lot of things, really things that we should have been doing all along that we didn't realize until the pandemic came along. And so I'm just wondering, within the work that you do when it comes to youth incarceration and mass incarceration, what are some of the lessons that the pandemic has perhaps taught you in the work that you do, perhaps things that we all should have been doing all along?
No, so I'm going to have to leave off here, but I think that the pandemic was eye-opening for me in a lot of ways. I spent a lot of time just counting the number of kids who were testing positive. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is that under those circumstances, we could actually see how many kids were in the facilities day by day. A lot of jurisdictions were much more transparent about that, the number of kids who were there and were testing positive. There's no reason that stuff shouldn't be available all the time, to know how many kids are there, what ages, level of offending, how long they're staying for. These are all things. You can't run a locked facility without counting the kids 4 times a day to make sure that everyone's still there, right? So simply counting and reporting the data publicly of how many kids by county, by region, by state are locked up for detention, for commitment, that's one thing. And secondly, as I said, like finding reasons to send kids home instead of finding reasons to lock kids up. I think that was the core lesson of the pandemic, that case by case, that there was a better decision made of, does it really make sense to detain this kid when we could do the hearing from home? We could do a Zoom hearing. We can check in by phone. There's no reason that stuff can't continue. And then the idea of providing services at home instead of in a locked facility. These are all things. I wrote a paper 2021, youth justice during the coronavirus, something like that. If you go to sentencingproject.org and search for COVID, you'll find that report. And we did have recommendations out of it. It's a little infuriating to me that we didn't create a new normal out of it. With that, I will have to leave. I thank you all so much for inviting me here today. I hope that we'll continue to be in touch going forward.
Thank you so much, Josh. We really appreciate your contribution.